The sky above the Hero Association's emergency response zone had already stopped looking like a sky. It looked like something had taken the atmosphere personally, folded it, and thrown it aside. Garou was no longer moving the way a human body moves. He was displacing air before his body arrived, leaving afterimages burned into the retinas of every S-class hero still conscious enough to watch. Flashy Flash, arguably the fastest hero alive, had stopped trying to track his movements and was instead watching the craters form, counting the delay between impact and sound, doing the math in his head and not liking any of the answers. Bang and Bomb, two of the most experienced martial artists in human history, were standing back to back not because they had a strategy, but because they had run out of them. The ground between them and Garou was not ground anymore. It was a record of every failed attempt to close distance, every deflected strike, every moment someone had believed their technique would be enough. Garou was evolving in real time. Every exchange pushed him further past the ceiling that the Hero Association had spent decades pretending was fixed. His body was absorbing the logic of their attacks, rewriting itself, returning something back that their bodies had no answer for. King was watching from behind a collapsed wall, and for the first time in his life, he was not afraid for himself. He was afraid for everyone else. And somewhere behind all of this, walking at a pace that could only be described as grocery strip casual, Saitama was about to arrive. And when Saitama arrives, the question is never whether it ends. The question is whether anyone survives long enough to see how. If you are watching this without a subscription, you are already behind on what is coming. Subscribe now, because Part 8 does not slow down. It accelerates into something none of these heroes are built to survive, and you need to be there when it lands. The emergency broadcast had been running for 11 minutes before anyone at the Hero Association's tactical center noticed that the coordinates being flagged were not updating. That was the first sign something was wrong, not with the battle, but with their ability to measure it. Garou had been moving so fast and so unpredictably across the Eastern District that the automated tracking system had simply given up trying to assign him a fixed position, and had instead begun logging a radius of probable destruction, which at this point covered roughly 40% of the city block grid between Sector 7 and Sector 11. The analysts watching the live feed from the surveillance drones were not taking notes anymore. They were just watching, the way you watch something fall from a very high place, knowing the landing is coming and knowing there is nothing useful you can do before it does. On the ground, the situation had a texture that no briefing document could have prepared anyone for. Atomic Samurai had arrived 12 minutes ago with 3 of his disciples, each of them carrying the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of mastering something difficult. 2 of his disciples had been removed from the fight within 90 seconds, not killed, but displaced so completely that their nervous systems had simply declined to continue participating. Atomic Samurai himself was still standing, which was its own kind of miracle, but he was standing the way a tree stands after a storm has already passed through it, technically upright, functionally compromised. His blade had connected with Garou 4 times. He knew this because he had counted. He also knew that none of those 4 connections had produced any meaningful result, which told him something about the gap between his ceiling and whatever ceiling Garou was currently operating near, that he was not emotionally prepared to process in the middle of a battlefield. Bang and Bomb had not stopped moving since the engagement began, and this was the only reason they were still functional. Their coordination was extraordinary, decades of shared martial philosophy expressed as a continuous flowing counterpoint, one covering while the other pressed, neither one committing fully to any line of attack, because full commitment meant full exposure, and full exposure meant what had happened to Atomic Samurai's disciples. They had managed to tag Garou 17 times between them, a number that would have been decisive against any other opponent in any other fight. Against Garou, it had produced something more unsettling than failure. It had produced adaptation. Every time their techniques landed, Garou's body processed the impact, identified the mechanical principle behind it, and began generating countermeasures in real time. Bang could feel it happening. He had spent his entire life reading opponents through contact, and what he was reading now felt less like a fighter learning and more like a system updating. Flashy Flash had disengaged 3 minutes ago, not from cowardice but from calculation. He was the fastest hero alive, arguably one of the fastest entities in the world, and he had spent those 3 minutes standing at distance, watching, constructing a model in his head of what Garou's movement patterns actually were versus what they appeared to be. The answer he kept arriving at was deeply uncomfortable, which was that the patterns were not patterns. Garou was not repeating. He was not cycling through a learned sequence the way most martial artists do under pressure. He was genuinely generating new movement each time, not from a library of techniques, but from something closer to physical intuition operating at a speed that made conscious thought irrelevant. Flash had fought monsters, demons, god-tier threats. He had never fought something that felt like it was solving him in real time. It was into this specific situation, this precise arrangement of elite heroes being systematically dismantled by something they could not adequately measure, that Saitama arrived. He came from the north end of the block, walking between 2 collapsed building facades, hands in his pockets, a plastic convenience store bag hanging from his left wrist. The bag contained a discounted pack of udon noodles, a bottle of soy sauce, and a coupon he had remembered at the last second and almost turned back for. He looked at the battlefield the way a person looks at a mildly interesting cloud formation, present, aware, mildly processing, not especially moved. Garou registered his arrival half a second before anyone else did, because Garou's senses had been operating beyond normal human range for the last several hours, and what he registered stopped him mid-movement in a way that nothing else had managed to do. Not because he recognized a threat, but because for the first time in this entire escalating catastrophe, his evolved instincts had encountered something they could not categorize, and that absence of categorization felt, in a way he had no framework to explain, like standing at the edge of something very deep. Bang turned and saw Saitama. His expression did something complicated. Across the rubble field, Flashy Flash saw him too, and the movement model he had been constructing in his head for Garou quietly became irrelevant, because whatever was about to happen next was not going to follow any model anyone had built. Bang spoke first, because Bang was the kind of person who spoke first when silence was about to become dangerous. He said Saitama's name, not loudly, not with any particular urgency, but with the specific careful tone a person uses when they are trying to establish that they recognize someone in a situation where recognition might be the only tool left available. Saitama turned toward the sound, located Bang in the rubble, raised one hand in a greeting that was entirely too casual for the surrounding environment, and said that he had been in the area and had heard something. That was it. That was the full extent of his situational briefing. He had heard something, decided to check, and had arrived at a scene where multiple S-class heroes were battered. The ground had been restructured by violence into something that resembled a geological event, and Garou, a being who had in the last several hours evolved past every ceiling the Hero Association's threat classification system possessed, was standing 20 meters away, radiating an energy signature that the drone overhead was actually struggling to process without its sensor array throwing error codes. Saitama looked at all of this, looked at his convenience store bag, and asked Bang if udon was better with or without the seasoning packet. Bomb, who had survived more genuinely catastrophic situations than almost any living person and had long ago made peace with the idea that the world was stranger than any single framework could contain, found himself staring, not at Garou, at Saitama. Because Bomb understood martial arts at a level that went beyond technique into something closer to spiritual physics. He understood force, intent, presence, the way a body announces what it is capable of before it moves, and what he was reading from Saitama right now was not readable. That was the precise problem. Every fighter bomb had ever encountered gave off something. A pressure, a weight, a directional sense of where their power lived and how it would express itself. Saitama gave off nothing. And Bomb had been alive long enough to understand that nothing, in this specific context, was not the same as empty. Nothing meant the instrument had no ceiling high enough to register what it was pointing at. Garou had not moved since Saitama's arrival, which was itself extraordinary. Garou had been in continuous motion for hours. Adaptation required engagement. Evolution required input. The entire logic of what he had become was built on the premise of constant escalating contact. But something had happened when Saitama walked into the space that Garou's instincts, now operating far beyond standard human parameters, could not resolve into actionable information. He was reading Saitama the same way he read every opponent, absorbing posture, weight distribution, breathing pattern, micro-tension in the muscles, and he was getting nothing that made sense. The posture said untrained. The weight distribution said someone who spent a lot of time standing in checkout lines. The breathing was completely even, not in the controlled way of a trained fighter managing exertion, but in the way of someone who had no exertion to manage. And underneath all of that, underneath every physical signal that Garou's evolved senses were capable of detecting, there was something else. Something that did not have a shape. Something that his instincts were registering not as a threat level but as a category error. As if the system he used to classify opponents had encountered an input it was never designed to process, and was now running the same failed calculation on a loop. Flashy Flash, still standing at the perimeter where he had withdrawn to think, watched Garou's stillness and felt something shift in his own assessment of the situation. Flash had identified Garou as the terminal problem, the thing at the end of the logical chain that nothing currently present could resolve. That assessment had lasted until approximately 30 seconds ago. Now he was revising it, not because anything had changed about Garou, but because the thing that had walked in from the north with a convenience store bag was producing a reaction in Garou that Flash had not believed was possible. Garou was hesitating. Not tactically, not strategically, not in the way a skilled fighter hesitates to select the optimal response. He was hesitating the way something hesitates when it encounters a wall it did not know existed. Saitama, having received no answer about the udon from Bang, who was still processing the fact that Garou had stopped moving, turned and looked at Garou directly for the first time. It was not an evaluating look. It was not the look of someone sizing up an opponent or calculating odds or feeling the weight of the moment. It was the look of someone who had just noticed something mildly out of place and was deciding whether it was worth addressing before the noodles got cold. He tilted his head slightly. He said, in a tone of genuine mild curiosity, that the other guy looked kind of weird. Garou's entire evolved threat processing architecture, which had in the last several hours developed the capacity to simultaneously track and counter 17 distinct martial arts styles, had no prepared response to being described as kind of weird by someone in a discount hero costume holding discounted udon. The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, which in a battlefield context is a very long time, and which Atomic Samurai, still braced against a collapsed pillar 20 meters away, would later describe as the most frightening 4 seconds of his professional career. Not because of what happened in them, but because of what he could feel building in them, the way you feel pressure change before weather arrives. Then Garou moved, not toward Saitama, toward the nearest S-class hero still standing, which was Bang, because Garou's tactical logic had momentarily overridden his instincts and told him that the known variables were safer to engage than the unknown one. His strike covered the distance in a fraction of a second and carried enough force to have ended the fight immediately. It did not end the fight because Saitama stepped, not ran, stepped into the path of the strike, and the impact that followed produced a shockwave that stripped the remaining glass from every standing structure within a 100-meter radius and knocked Flashy Flash, the fastest hero alive, off his feet from pure atmospheric displacement. Garou's fist had connected with Saitama's open palm. Saitama's expression had not changed. He looked, if anything, faintly annoyed, not at the power of the strike, but at the interruption, the way you are faintly annoyed when someone bumps into you while you are trying to read a sign. Bang looked at the palm catch. He looked at Garou. He looked at Saitama. Then he sat down on a piece of rubble because his legs had made a unilateral decision that standing was no longer the appropriate response to the information being received. The Hero Association's Tactical Operations Center was located in a reinforced underground facility that had been designed to survive Category 5 monster attacks, direct artillery impact, and the kind of structural failures that came from having the world's most powerful beings periodically destroy large sections of the city above it. It had survived all of those things. What it was not surviving particularly well right now was the data coming in from Sector 9, because the data from Sector 9 did not fit into any existing analytical framework the facility possessed. And when you build an entire institution around the premise of classifying, ranking, and deploying power in measurable increments, data that refuses to be measured is not just a technical problem. It is an existential one. The senior analyst on duty had been staring at the same sensor readout for 6 minutes. The readout showed the moment of contact between Garou and the unidentified hero, later cross-referenced as Saitama, B-Class Rank 7 hero name, Caped Baldy, and what it showed was that the force generated by that single palm catch had exceeded every upper limit the sensor array was calibrated to record. Not approached, exceeded. The system had not produced a number. It had produced a symbol that the software used to indicate that the input was outside the designed measurement range. A symbol that the analyst had previously only seen in testing scenarios designed to find the boundaries of the equipment, never in live combat data. The director of operations, a woman named Sitch who had spent 15 years making hard decisions in impossible situations, and who had developed a very reliable internal alarm system for when a situation was about to change categories entirely, was standing behind the analyst and looking at the same symbol. She had already pulled Saitama's hero file, which was not a comforting document. B-Class Rank 7, Registered Hero. Monthly hero activity logs that were mostly blank or contained entries like defeated monster, returned home. No recorded power assessment beyond the initial registration physical, which had been flagged as a system error because the equipment had malfunctioned during the test and produced no usable data. An incident that at the time had been attributed to faulty hardware and had since been sitting in an administrative archive folder that nobody had looked at in 2 years. Sitch was looking at it now. She was thinking about the gap between faulty hardware and hardware that encountered something it was not built to measure, and she was not finding the gap as wide as she would have liked. She picked up the direct line to the S-Class Hero Coordination Channel and told whoever was listening, which turned out to be King, who had been quietly monitoring the channel from behind his collapsed wall, that she needed a situation report on Caped Baldy's current status and combat effectiveness. King's response took a moment longer than it should have, and when it came, it was careful in a way that told Sitch everything she needed to know about how the ground-level read was going. King said that Caped Baldy appeared to be present at the engagement site, and that the situation appeared to be developing. Sitch asked King to be more specific. King said that Garou had thrown a strike that by his own conservative estimate should have been enough to level a city block, and that Caped Baldy had caught it in one hand without moving his feet. There was a pause. Then King added quietly that Caped Baldy was still holding the convenience store bag in his other hand, and that the bag appeared undamaged. Across the city, in a different kind of operations center, cleaner, quieter, more expensive, the kind of room where decisions get made that never appear in public records. A different set of people were watching the same drone feed and having a different kind of conversation. The Hero Association was a public institution with public accountability and public constraints. The organization watching from this room had none of those things, and they had been monitoring Garou's evolution for the last several hours, not with alarm, but with a very focused, very cold professional interest. Garou represented something they had been theorizing about for years, an adaptive biological escalation that could, in theory, be studied, replicated, eventually controlled. The men and women in this room had been constructing scenarios in which Garou's evolution reached its ceiling, was contained, and was then reverse-engineered into something useful. Those scenarios had been running on a very specific assumption, which was that Garou's ceiling was the highest ceiling in the current engagement. The drone feed from Sector 9 was in the process of destroying that assumption, and the people in the room were watching it happen with the particular stillness of experts realizing that their most important variable was wrong. The man running the room pulled up Saitama's public hero file on a secondary screen. He read it. He read it again. Then he turned to the woman to his left, who was the organization's senior power assessment specialist, and asked her what B-Class Rank 7 meant in practical terms. She told him it meant the Hero Association had categorized this individual as a mid-tier professional hero with no exceptional combat record and no assessed special abilities. He looked at the drone feed. He looked at the file. He asked her very carefully what the probability was that the Hero Association's assessment was accurate. She looked at the frozen frame from the drone feed showing Garou's fist in Saitama's palm, the shockwave radius, the structural damage to the surrounding blocks, and the expression on Saitama's face, which was mild and slightly preoccupied and entirely inconsistent with having just absorbed a strike of that magnitude. She told him the probability was functionally 0. He nodded slowly and told the room that they needed to completely revise their operational picture, because the terminal variable in this engagement was not Garou. The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way rooms are quiet when everyone in them is updating a model they had believed was complete. Back in Sector 9, Saitama had released Garou's fist. He had done it not because he was finished or because the exchange had reached a natural conclusion, but because his udon was going to get warm in the bag and he wanted to get home before the coupon window closed. He looked at his hand, not checking for damage. There was no damage, he was just looking. And then he looked at Garou, who had pulled his arm back and was standing in a posture that his entire evolved threat processing system was generating conflicting instructions about. Because every instinct said attack, and every deeper instinct said something else entirely. Saitama scratched the back of his head and said, to nobody in particular, that the weird-looking guy was pretty strong. Bang, still sitting on the rubble, closed his eyes. Atomic Samurai, still braced against the pillar, made a sound that was not quite a word. And Garou, for only the second time since his evolution had begun, felt something that his expanding consciousness had no prepared category for, something that lived in the space between recognition and denial, between knowing and refusing to know. The evacuation broadcasts had been running for 2 hours by the time the civilian population of the eastern districts fully understood that the broadcasts were not precautionary. In the early stages of monster-level incidents, the Hero Association had a standard communication protocol that was deliberately calibrated to convey urgency, without inducing mass panic, measured language, clear exit routes, reassurances about hero response times. The broadcast that went out at the start of the Garou engagement had followed that protocol exactly. The broadcast that went out 40 minutes later, after the first round of S-class deployments, had produced results that the tactical center's damage projection models had not predicted, was slightly less measured. The broadcast running now, which had been drafted by Sitch personally, and had gone through 0 rounds of public relations review because there was no time, was using words like immediate and all civilians, and do not attempt to observe, in a tone that people who had lived in cities protected by heroes their entire lives recognized instinctively as different from the usual tone. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the absence of the particular institutional confidence that normally lived underneath them. The city was listening to its safety infrastructure sound uncertain, and it was responding the way populations respond to that specific frequency of uncertainty, which is to say it was moving, quickly, away from the eastern districts. And the people moving were not talking much, because talking required processing, and processing required a model of what was happening, and nobody had a working model anymore. The physical condition of the eastern districts gave the evacuation a visual context that the broadcasts had not fully prepared people for. Entire block faces had been restructured by the accumulated force exchanges of the S-class engagement, not destroyed in the way a fire destroys or a flood destroys, but reshaped, compressed, folded, as if the matter composing the buildings had been reminded that its current arrangement was only one option among many and had been briefly persuaded to try something different. Streets that had been straight were no longer straight. Intersections that had been level had developed new geometries. The drone operators who were supposed to be providing real-time mapping data for evacuation route guidance were having to recalculate every 4 minutes because the terrain kept changing, and the changes were not slowing down, because the engagement in Sector 9 was not slowing down. What was happening in Sector 9 specifically had developed, in the 20 minutes since Saitama's palm catch, into something that the Tactical Operations Center had stopped trying to narrate in real time and had started simply recording for later analysis, because the speed and scale of events had exceeded the capacity of the available analytical vocabulary. Garou had made 11 separate offensive movements in those 20 minutes. Each one had been faster, more powerful, and more technically refined than the last, because Garou's adaptive evolution was still functioning exactly as it had been functioning all day, processing input, integrating it, returning something greater. The difference was the input he was now processing. Every previous engagement had given his evolution something to work with, a martial arts style, a power type, a fighting philosophy that his expanding consciousness could absorb and transcend. Saitama was not giving his evolution anything to work with, and this was not because Saitama was withholding or defending or managing the engagement. It was because Saitama was not doing anything that could be described as a martial arts style, or a power type, or a fighting philosophy. He was just standing there, occasionally moving, and the movements he made when he did move were so far outside the range of anything Garou's processing system had been built to analyze that they were not producing usable data. They were producing structural damage to the surrounding environment and expressions of increasing confusion on Garou's face, but not usable data. Flashy Flash had retreated to a position on top of a partially standing building facade 2 blocks north of the main engagement, and from this position he was watching with an attention so focused it had become almost meditative. Flash had built his entire identity, his entire self-concept, his entire relationship with the world, around being the fastest. Speed was not just his power, it was his framework. He understood reality through the lens of relative velocity, and this understanding had served him extraordinarily well for his entire career. What he was watching now was systematically and thoroughly dismantling that framework, because Saitama was not fast in any way that Flash's framework could accommodate. Fast implied effort, implied optimization, implied a body pushed to its mechanical limits to close distance in minimal time. Saitama was not doing any of that. He was moving at whatever speed the situation casually required and arriving wherever he needed to be without any visible investment of effort. And the results of these casual, uninvested movements were producing atmospheric disturbances that Flash's instruments, the ones built into his suit for performance monitoring, were flagging as inconsistent with any hero-class physical output on record. Flash had been quietly proud of his own sensor readings for years. Looking at Saitama's readings now, his own felt like the results of a child's foot race. Bang had recovered enough to stand, though standing was about the extent of what his body was currently offering him as an option. He was watching the engagement with the eyes of someone who had spent 60 years learning to read fighters, and was now in the presence of something that reading could not touch. What troubled Bang, and he would think about this later, in quieter circumstances, and it would trouble him for a long time, was not Saitama's power. Power, even incomprehensible power, was still a category Bang could place within his understanding of the world. What troubled him was the expression on Saitama's face, which had not changed since he had arrived. It was not the expression of someone suppressing effort, which was a specific kind of stillness Bang knew well from masters who had learned to internalize their exertion. It was the expression of someone for whom effort was not a concept that applied to the current situation in any meaningful way. It was the expression of someone doing something that cost them nothing, and the something in question was absorbing the full output of an entity that had spent the last several hours evolving, past every limit the human world had agreed to treat as a ceiling. The coupon in Saitama's bag expired at 9. It was currently 8:47. He looked at his watch, a cheap digital one with a slightly cracked face, and then looked at Garou, who was in the middle of generating what his evolution had assessed as a significantly more refined attack vector than anything he had yet attempted. Saitama watched the attack come with mild interest, the way you watch a bus approach a stop you're standing at, blocked it with a forearm that he did not bother to properly position, and the resulting shockwave removed the top 2 floors from the building Flash was standing on. Flash moved fast enough to survive. The building did not survive. Saitama looked at his watch again and said, to the general air, that he needed to wrap this up. Garou, who had evolved far enough to understand spoken language as a battlefield signal, heard this and felt something cold move through him that was not fear, because fear was a category he had long since transcended, but was adjacent to fear in the way that standing at the edge of something very deep is adjacent to falling. Part 5. When governments look up and see something they cannot budget for. The first military satellite repositioned over the Eastern District at 8:51 in the evening, which was 11 minutes after the Defense Ministry's automated threat monitoring system had flagged the Sector 9 engagement as exceeding its top classification tier, and escalated the alert to a level that required human authorization to proceed further. The human who received that authorization request was a deputy minister who had been in 3 previous monster-level incidents, and who had developed, over the course of those 3 incidents, a fairly reliable sense of when a situation was serious versus when it was the kind of serious that the Hero Association and its S-Class heroes could resolve with acceptable collateral damage and a public statement. He looked at the sensor data attached to the authorization request. He looked at the structural damage mapping for the Eastern Districts. He looked at the power output readings flagged from the Sector 9 engagement, the ones that had caused the sensor array to produce error symbols instead of numbers. Then he authorized the satellite reposition and picked up a phone that connected to a room he had never needed to use before, which was the ministry's direct line to the Joint Chiefs of the National Self-Defense Force. And he told the person who answered that he needed a full threat assessment briefing within 20 minutes, and that the briefing needed to account for the possibility that the terminal threat in the current engagement was not the entity previously classified as the primary threat. The Joint Chiefs briefing room filled up in 14 minutes, which was fast by institutional standards, and which told everyone in the room something about how the preliminary data had landed with the people who had seen it first. The senior intelligence officer leading the briefing had spent the last hour pulling every available piece of information on the Sector 9 engagement, cross-referencing it with the Hero Association's public hero database, and constructing a timeline of events that she was reasonably confident was accurate. She was less confident about what the timeline meant, and she opened the briefing by saying so, which was unusual enough in this room that it produced a specific quality of attention, the attention of people who are used to being given certainty and have just been told that certainty is not available. She walked through the timeline. She showed the sensor readings. She showed the drone footage of the Palm catch, the 11 offensive exchanges, the atmospheric disturbances recorded during Saitama's casual deflections. She showed the structural damage radius overlaid on a city map and noted that the pattern of damage was not consistent with a single powerful entity fighting defensively, which was the standard pattern for contained monster engagements, but was instead consistent with force exchanges of a scale and frequency that the existing framework for hero-class combat had not previously needed to account for. Then she showed them Saitama's hero file. B-Class. Rank 7. Caped Baldy. The room was quiet for a moment, and then a general in the far corner asked, with the careful precision of someone who understood that the framing of a question determines the range of available answers, whether the Hero Association's classification system was capable of accurately assessing the entity currently present in Sector 9. The intelligence officer said no. The general nodded slowly and said that in that case, they needed to discuss what the classification system's failure meant for their operational picture, because every contingency protocol the self-defense force possessed was built on the assumption that the Hero Association's classifications were a reliable ceiling for what they would encounter. And if that ceiling was wrong, the protocols were wrong with it. Outside the city, at a distance that the Tactical Operations Center had established as the current safe observation perimeter, a perimeter that had been moved outward twice in the last hour as the engagement's effective radius kept expanding, a network of independent journalists, streaming operators, and civilian observers with recording equipment had established an informal documentation line. The Hero Association's public communications team had asked them to move back. The Self-Defense Force's forward observers had asked them to move back. Nobody had physically moved them back, because physically moving them back would have required deploying personnel to the perimeter, and the personnel available were needed elsewhere. And so they were still there, recording, and what they were recording was being transmitted in real time to platforms that the Hero Association had no jurisdiction over, and the Self-Defense Force had no practical mechanism to suppress. The footage was not high quality, too much atmospheric disturbance, too much debris, too much distance, but it was clear enough to show the scale of what was happening in Sector 9, and scale, it turned out, was the thing that required no analytical framework to understand. You did not need to know what a power output reading meant, or what a sensor error symbol indicated to understand what you were seeing when you watched a shockwave from a blocked punch strip, the upper floors off a building 2 blocks away from the impact point. The footage was being watched by a very large number of people, and the comments underneath, it were not the comments of people who believed the Hero Association's standard public messaging about the situation being under control. Sitch, in the Tactical Operations Center, had been on a continuous call with the Hero Association's board of directors for the last 25 minutes. The board wanted to know when the engagement would be resolved. Sitch told them she did not have a timeline. They asked her who was handling the resolution. She told them that based on current ground-level data, the entity most likely to resolve the engagement was Caped Baldy, at which point the board asked her to repeat that because they believed they had misheard. She repeated it. There was a silence on the call that had a specific texture, the texture of institutional certainty encountering something it was not structured to absorb. The board asked her what Caped Baldy's current status was. Sitch pulled up the latest drone feed and looked at it for a moment before answering. On the feed, Saitama was standing in the middle of the Sector 9 engagement zone. Garou was approximately 15 meters away, generating what the sensor array's remaining functional components were reading as the highest energy output of the entire engagement. Saitama was looking at his watch. Sitch told the board that Caped Baldy appeared to be checking the time. The board asked what that meant tactically. Sitch said she did not think it meant anything tactically. She thought it meant he had somewhere to be. Another silence. Then the board chair asked, in a tone that had moved past professional and into something more personal, whether Sitch believed the entity in Sector 9, the one that had stopped Garou's evolution-enhanced strikes with a palm catch, that had been casually deflecting attacks that were restructuring the surrounding city blocks, that the sensor array could not produce a reading for, whether that entity was going to be a problem going forward. Sitch looked at the drone feed. She looked at Saitama's expression, which was the same expression it had been since he arrived. She thought about the coupon in his convenience store bag and the fact that the coupon window closed in 8 minutes. She told the board chair, as precisely as she could, that she did not think Caped Baldy was going to be a problem. She thought the problem was that nobody had known he existed until tonight, and that the gap between what the Hero Association thought it knew about the power landscape it was operating in and what the power landscape actually contained was larger than any institutional framework they currently possessed was built to address. The board chair asked her what she recommended. She said she recommended they start building a new framework, and that they do it quickly, because the old one had just become a historical document. Part 6. Garou reaches for a ceiling that is not there. Garou had broken through 17 ceilings in the last 6 hours. This was not a metaphor. It was a precise description of what his evolution had done. Sequentially, each time the engagement had produced a new upper limit for him to process and transcend. The first ceiling had been the one that separated trained human fighters from elite human fighters, and he had passed through it so early in the evening that it barely registered as a memory anymore. The ceilings after that had come faster and with more resistance. The ceiling that separated elite human fighters from hero-class combatants, the ceiling that separated hero-class from S-class, the ceiling that separated S-class physical capability from something that did not have an existing classification, because the Hero Association had never needed to classify anything above S-class, because S-class had always been the end of the scale. He had passed through all of them. Each passage had cost him something, a version of himself that was no longer sufficient, and each time he had shed that version and emerged as something larger, something that contained the previous version, the way an ocean contains a cup of water, present but no longer meaningful as a unit of measurement. This process was the core of what Garou had become. It was also, he was now beginning to understand in a way that was genuinely new and genuinely destabilizing, dependent on a specific condition that the current engagement was no longer providing. The condition was a ceiling. Every evolution required a ceiling to push against. The process was not random generation. It was directional, targeted, a specific biological and psychic response to encountering a limit and refusing it. Remove the limit and the process had nothing to aim at. This was the precise nature of the problem Garou was facing in Sector 9, articulated in terms his evolving consciousness was only now fully processing. Saitama was not a ceiling. Saitama was not a wall or a barrier or an upper limit of any kind that Garou's evolution could identify, engage, and transcend. Saitama was an absence of ceiling, and an absence of ceiling was not something his evolution had a mechanism for, because the mechanism required a surface to push against, and there was no surface. Every attack Garou generated, regardless of how refined or powerful, was not returning data about where Saitama's limit was. It was returning data about where Garou's limit was, which was not the same thing, and was in fact the opposite of useful information for an entity whose entire existence was built around the premise of transcending limits. He stood at the far edge of the Sector 9 clearing and generated the next attack, which was the most sophisticated thing his evolution had yet produced. It incorporated the mechanical principles of Bang's water stream style, the angular geometry of Bomb's whirlwind iron-cutting fist, the velocity optimization he had absorbed from 3 separate exchanges with Flashy Flash, and something else, something that had emerged from the last hour of processing Saitama's casual deflections. A pattern his evolution had been attempting to extract from those interactions that was not quite a martial arts principle and not quite a power type, but was closer to a physical philosophy, a way of existing in space relative to force that Garou's consciousness was trying to reverse engineer without having nearly enough data to do it correctly. The attack that emerged from all of this was genuinely extraordinary. Bang, watching from the rubble, recognized elements of his own style in it and felt a complex emotion that combined pride and grief in roughly equal measure. Flashy Flash, from his new position on street level, clocked the velocity and his instruments flagged it as the fastest single movement recorded in the engagement. Atomic Samurai, who had been silent for a long time, straightened slightly and acknowledged internally that what he was watching was something that deserved acknowledgement. The attack connected with Saitama's left side. Saitama had been in the process of turning to look at a piece of debris that had landed near his convenience store bag, because he had thought for a moment that the bag had been hit, and he wanted to check the udon. The attack connected while he was in this mid-turn, in a posture that no trained fighter would ever intentionally adopt while receiving an offensive strike, with his weight distributed incorrectly and his attention directed elsewhere. The result was a pressure wave that traveled outward from the point of contact in a perfect sphere, stripping the remaining standing facades from every structure in a 200-meter radius and creating a crater in the street surface under Saitama's feet that was 4 meters deep and 12 meters wide. Saitama looked down at the crater, then at the bag, which was undamaged. He exhaled in mild relief about the bag. Then he looked at Garou with an expression that contained, for the first time, something that was not mild curiosity or casual indifference, but was closer to a faint, genuine surprise, not at the power of the attack, but at the fact that the attack had interrupted his concern about the bag, which he had not expected because he had not been paying full attention to the engagement at the time. Garou read that expression with his evolved senses and understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that the surprise was not about him. The surprise was about the bag. He had generated the most powerful and sophisticated attack of his existence, and the entity receiving it had been surprised about a bag of noodles. This information traveled through Garou's expanding consciousness and produced a response that was not anger, not despair, not any emotion his evolution had previously needed to develop a category for. It was something closer to the specific cognitive state that occurs when a fundamental assumption reveals itself to be wrong, not wrong in a correctable way, not wrong in a way that generates a new strategy, but wrong in a structural way that calls into question the premises that generated the assumption. Garou had assumed, because his entire existence had trained him to assume, that enough power directed with enough precision at enough speed would eventually find a limit in whatever it was aimed at. This was not an aggressive assumption. It was a physical one. It was the kind of assumption that the universe itself seemed to operate on. He was now standing in a crater of his own making, looking at an entity that had been distracted by grocery concerns during the reception of his greatest attack, and the assumption was not holding. Bang watched Garou's stillness and recognized it. He had seen that specific quality of stillness once before, very early in his career, when he had encountered a master whose level was so far beyond his own that the encounter had not felt like a fight. It had felt like a lesson about the shape of the world. He had stood very still after that encounter too, processing the gap between what he had believed was possible and what he had just seen demonstrated. He had eventually found his way through that stillness into something useful. He was not sure Garou had a path through this one, because the gap Garou was currently processing was not the kind that generated new directions. It was the kind that ended them. The coupon expired in 3 minutes. Saitama checked his watch one more time, looked at Garou, and said, with the specific tired patience of someone who has been waiting for something to finish so they can do something else, that they should probably just get this done. There is a specific quality of silence that descends on a battlefield when everyone present simultaneously arrives at the same conclusion through different paths. It is not the silence of pauses between engagements, which has a held-breath quality, a sense of suspension before resumption. It is not the silence of exhaustion, which is heavy and directional, pointing toward rest. It is the silence of comprehension. The silence that occurs when multiple minds, operating from different frameworks and different histories and different relationships to the events in front of them, all land on the same understanding at the same moment, and the understanding is large enough that none of them have words immediately available for it. That silence fell over Sector 9 in the 3 seconds between Saitama, saying they should probably just get this done, and Saitama beginning to move toward Garou. And every person present experienced it differently, but experienced it completely, without exception, and without the ability to mistake it for anything else. Bang experienced it as a martial artist. He had spent 60 years building a framework for understanding power, not just measuring it, but understanding its nature, its source, its relationship to the person expressing it. That framework had categories for everything he had ever encountered. It had categories for things he had not encountered but had theorized about, sealing cases he had constructed in his mind during long training sessions as thought experiments, asking himself what the absolute upper boundary of physical expression might look like if every limiting factor were removed. He had built those thought experiments carefully, and they were the most extreme things his imagination had been able to generate. Saitama walking toward Garou at a pace that could only be described as purposeful but unhurried was outside those thought experiments entirely, not at their boundary, outside them. The framework Bang had spent 60 years building was not straining to accommodate what he was seeing. It had simply become irrelevant, the way a ruler becomes irrelevant when you are trying to measure a continent. Flashy Flash experienced it as a speed specialist. His entire relationship with combat was built on the axis of velocity, the premise that the fastest entity in any engagement controlled the engagement, because speed was the variable that determined whether all other variables got to apply. He had never seriously questioned this premise, because his experience had never given him cause to. He was watching Saitama move toward Garou now, and tracking the movement with the same instruments he used to track everything, and the instruments were producing a reading that his understanding of physics was resisting. Saitama was not moving fast. He was moving at a pace that Flash could track without effort, a pace that was well within normal human walking speed if you measured it in the conventional way, which was distance covered per unit of time. The problem was that the conventional measurement was not capturing what was actually happening, because the space between Saitama and Garou was not behaving the way space normally behaved when something moved through it. It was as if the distance were cooperating, as if the geometry of the approach were adjusting itself to make the destination arrive at the walker rather than the other way around. Flash had no technical vocabulary for what he was observing. He had the strong sense that no technical vocabulary existed. Atomic Samurai experienced it as a swordsman. He had a swordsman's relationship to decisive moments. He understood them better than almost anyone alive, understood the precise instant when a fight shifted from contest to conclusion, the moment when the outcome became fixed even though the final exchange had not yet occurred. He had felt that moment arrive in every significant fight of his career, always with the same quality, a kind of crystallization, the future condensing from possibility into certainty. He was feeling it now, sitting against his pillar with 2 cracked ribs and a blade that had stopped being useful approximately 40 minutes ago. And what made this particular crystallization different from every previous one he had experienced was its scale. Every previous decisive moment he had felt had been the conclusion of a fight between 2 entities operating within the same general order of magnitude. This was not that. This was a decisive moment at a different level of reality, a crystallization that was not just about the outcome of this fight, but about the nature of the world that contained it. And sitting inside that moment felt like sitting inside a historical event, while it was happening, and knowing that everything after it would be different in ways that could not yet be fully specified. King experienced it most simply, which was appropriate given King's particular relationship with the truth of power. King had spent his career being credited with things he had not done, and possessing things he did not have, and this experience had given him an unusually clear-eyed relationship with the difference between the appearance of power and its reality. He had always known, without self-deception, exactly where his own power ended, which was essentially at the border of his physical body, beyond which his reputation did the work that his capability could not. He had also always had, beneath the anxiety and the imposter architecture, a very precise intuition for the real thing, for actual power when it was in the room, because actual power had a quality that reputation could not replicate no matter how carefully it was constructed. He was feeling that quality now at an intensity that made every previous instance of it feel like a preliminary sketch. He was not afraid. This was the strangest part of what he was experiencing. He was not afraid, and fear was his constant companion, his most familiar emotional state, the weather he lived in. The absence of fear was itself disorienting, and he spent a moment trying to understand it before arriving at the explanation. He was not afraid because whatever was about to happen was so far outside the category of things that fear was a useful response to that his nervous system had simply declined to generate it. Fear was for situations where outcomes were uncertain. There was nothing uncertain about what he was watching. Garou, for his part, had stopped generating attacks. This was not a strategic decision. Strategy implied a model of the engagement that could inform decisions about resource allocation and timing, and Garou no longer had a working model of the engagement. What he had instead was his evolved consciousness, which was still processing at speeds and depths that would have been incomprehensible to any previous version of himself. And what that consciousness was processing right now was the full weight of the information the last hour had produced. He had attacked 31 times. He had evolved between attacks, each evolution representing a genuine transcendence of the previous version of his capability. The 31st attack had been the most powerful and precise thing his existence had yet generated. None of the 31 attacks had produced any change in the entity receiving them that could be described as a response. Not adaptation, not defense posture adjustment, not any of the things a fighter does when they are engaging with a genuine challenge. Saitama had received 31 attacks from an entity that had spent the evening evolving past the S-class ceiling, and had responded to each one with the energy investment of someone swatting away a slow-moving insect while thinking about something else. Garou's consciousness was large enough now to hold this information fully and examine it from every angle, and every angle produced the same answer, which was that the ceiling he had been reaching for did not exist above him. It had never been above him. It was beside him, in a direction he had no mechanism to move, held by something that was not competing with him and had never been competing with him, and would not begin competing with him regardless of how high he evolved, because competition required two parties operating in the same space, and Saitama was not operating in his space. Saitama was operating in a space that contained his space, the way the sky contains a room. Saitama stopped 2 meters from Garou and looked at him with an expression that was, somehow, the most devastating thing anyone on the battlefield had witnessed all evening, not because it was fierce or cold or triumphant, but because it was genuinely, mildly, almost apologetically matter-of-fact. He said that the weird-looking guy seemed kind of tired. He said it with the tone of someone noticing something obvious that everybody else had been too polite to mention. And Garou, who had evolved past language as a functional limitation, past emotion as a constraint, past every category of experience that his origin as a human being had installed in him. Garou looked back at Saitama and felt, moving through the vast architecture of his expanded consciousness like a single cold drop of water through an empty hall, something that he recognized despite having transcended its conventional form. He recognized it because transcendence does not erase origin, and origin had installed this particular response so deeply that no amount of evolution could fully reach it. What Garou felt was not fear of Saitama. It was the recognition of what Saitama represented, the recognition that the story he had been telling himself about the shape of power, about its direction and its ceiling, and the relationship between effort and outcome, was a story that this moment was about to end. Part 8. The punch that did not need to happen and HAPPENED anyway. The coupon had expired 4 minutes ago. Saitama had checked his watch at the exact moment it happened and had made a small sound, not quite a word, somewhere between acknowledgement and mild disappointment. That flashy flash, standing 30 meters away, had heard clearly despite the ambient noise of settling debris and distant emergency sirens. Flash had heard it and had felt, in that moment, a dissonance so complete that it temporarily displaced his ability to process anything else about the situation. The most powerful entity he had ever encountered, standing 2 meters from an evolved being that had spent 6 hours transcending every limit the human world possessed, had just made a small sound of mild disappointment about a grocery coupon. Flash stood with this information for a moment and then set it aside, not because he had resolved it, but because he had not been built to resolve it, and continuing to try was not productive. The thing that happened next did not announce itself. There was no buildup, no gathering of energy, no visible preparation of any kind. In every significant power display Flash had ever witnessed, there had been a precursor, a compression, a shift in atmospheric pressure, a change in the quality of light or sound that indicated something large was being assembled before being released. He had learned to read those precursors the way a sailor reads weather, using them to prepare for what was coming, and this skill had kept him functional in situations that had removed less observant fighters from the equation entirely. There was no precursor here. Saitama moved one arm. That was the complete description of what happened at the physical level. One arm moved, in a motion that was technically a punch, performed at a speed that Flash's instruments registered, and then immediately flagged as potentially corrupted data, because the number was not consistent with any previously recorded physical output. The motion was compact, economical, containing none of the dramatic extension or rotational force generation that characterized powerful strikes from trained fighters. It looked, from a technical standpoint, like a jab thrown by someone who had learned to punch from a basic instructional video and had not yet developed the form refinements that serious practitioners spent years acquiring. The results of this technically unimpressive motion were not consistent with its appearance. The pressure wave that traveled outward from the point of contact arrived at Flash's position before the sound did, which told him something about the ratio of force to duration that his instruments were struggling to calculate. The wave hit him with enough force to require his full stabilization response to remain upright, and Flash's stabilization response was calibrated for the upper range of S-class impact events. He remained upright. The building behind him did not. The buildings behind that building did not. The pressure wave traveled outward in a cone that widened as it went, and what it encountered as it traveled, structures, vehicles, debris fields from earlier exchanges, the accumulated physical record of 6 hours of S-class combat. It treated with a uniform indifference that made no distinction between structural steel and loose rubble, between reinforced concrete and glass, between things that had survived the evening's earlier events and things that had not. The wave moved through it all, and the materials it encountered made their accommodation, and the accommodation was total. Garou was at the center of this. Whatever his evolved consciousness had been preparing to generate as a response to Saitama's approach, and it had been generating something. Flash could tell from the quality of energy displacement in the air around Garou in the seconds before the punch. It did not finish generating it. The punch arrived before the preparation completed, not because of the speed, though the speed was beyond anything Flash had recorded, but because preparation had become irrelevant at a point that preceded the punch. And what had made it irrelevant was the quality of inevitability that had been building in the air of Sector 9, since Saitama had said they should probably just get this done. Garou's evolved consciousness, operating at the highest level it had yet reached, had understood the punch was coming, and had done everything it was capable of doing to respond. And what it was capable of doing was not sufficient in the way that a very good answer is not sufficient when the question has changed to something the answer was not built for. The sound arrived after the wave, a concussive report that the Tactical Operations Center's audio monitoring registered and immediately clipped, because it exceeded the recording equipment's input ceiling. Another instrument producing an error symbol instead of a number. Another piece of infrastructure discovering its own boundary, in the act of trying to measure something that did not acknowledge boundaries. Sitch, watching the drone feed, saw the wave expand and saw the camera on the primary observation drone destabilize and saw, in the 2 seconds before the drone's stabilization systems recovered, the altered geography of Sector 9, the new depth of the impact crater, the cleared radius, the way the remaining structural elements at the edge of the blast zone were leaning uniformly outward like grass after a very strong wind. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she made a note in the incident log. The note said, "Primary threat neutralized, Cape Baldy method, single strike time logged." She looked at it after she wrote it and then added a second note that said, "Classification framework review required, urgent, all tiers." Bang had been knocked from his position on the rubble by the wave and had landed on a piece of relatively flat debris 12 meters from where he had been sitting, which was actually a softer landing than several he had taken earlier in the evening, and which his body absorbed without significant additional complaint. He lay on his back for a moment and looked at the sky above Sector 9, which was doing something unusual. The pressure wave had moved fast enough, and with enough vertical component that it had displaced a visible column of the low cloud cover above the impact point, creating a circular clearing in the clouds through which the night sky was visible, clean and dark, and full of stars that the city's light pollution usually obscured. Bang looked at the stars through the hole in the clouds and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific quality of smallness that arrives when the world demonstrates that it is larger than your model of it in a way that is not threatening but is simply true. He had felt it as a young man, before he had spent decades becoming one of the most powerful humans alive, and had gradually, without intending to, allowed his model of the world to contract around his own capabilities as a reference point. He felt it now, lying on debris in Sector 9, looking at stars through a hole punched in the clouds by a casual jab thrown by a bald man in a discount hero suit who was annoyed about a coupon. Atomic Samurai had not moved from his pillar. He was watching the impact crater and the altered landscape beyond it with the eyes of someone who has just watched a thing happen that they will spend a long time thinking about. He had fought monsters, demons, beings classified at the absolute upper end of the dragon threat tier. He had always believed, not arrogantly but matter-of-factly, that if something could be found and reached, he could eventually devise a way to cut it. He was not sure he still believed this. He was not sure the belief had survived contact with what he had watched tonight, and losing a belief that had been structural, one of the load-bearing elements of his self-understanding, left a gap that he was not going to fill quickly. He sat with the gap and looked at the crater and understood that the gap was accurate and that accuracy, however uncomfortable, was more useful than the belief it had replaced. Saitama walked to the edge of the crater and looked into it. Garou was at the bottom. Not destroyed, Saitama had not thrown the punch with destruction in mind, because destruction had not been the point and Saitama's punches went where his intent went and no further, which was itself a kind of control, so complete it had no name in any fighting tradition. Garou was at the bottom of the crater and he was breathing, which was something, and his evolved form was still coherent, which was also something, but what he was and what he had been when the evening started were connected only by continuity of memory, and the memory of what he had believed about himself and the world and the relationship between power and ceiling was going to take a very long time to reconcile with the information the crater represented. Saitama looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not triumphant and not cold, but was, if anything, faintly sympathetic in the specific way of someone who has been in a situation once that the other person is in for the first time, not the same situation, but the same shape of situation, the same specific variety of arriving at a limit you did not know existed. He picked up his convenience store bag, checked the udon was intact, and began walking north toward home. The first thing that changed was the silence, not the comprehension silence that had fallen before the punch. That silence had broken with the pressure wave and had not reformed. This was a different silence, the one that arrives after something very large has finished happening, and the world is in the process of deciding what it is now. It settled over Sector 9 like something physical, like a material that had been waiting for the noise to clear before it could occupy the space the noise had been filling, and it was not comfortable, and it was not peaceful, but it was absolute in the way that only silences following absolute events can be. The emergency sirens in the surrounding districts were still running. The Tactical Operations Center's audio monitoring was still logging. The streams from the civilian observation line outside the perimeter were still transmitting. All of that noise existed. None of it reached inside the silence of Sector 9, because the silence of Sector 9 was not about the absence of sound. It was about the absence of uncertainty, and uncertainty had been the animating force of everything that had preceded this moment, and its departure had left something that noise could not fill. Bang was the first person to move with purpose. He had been lying on the debris looking at the stars through the hole in the clouds, and at some point, he could not have specified exactly when, the smallness he was feeling had shifted into something more functional. Not resolve exactly, not the trained practitioner's return to operational readiness, but something more basic and more honest, which was the simple human recognition that there were other people present who might need assistance, and that sitting still was not a response to that recognition he could sustain. He got up carefully, assessed his physical inventory: 3 cracked ribs, a deep bruise along his left forearm where he had blocked something in the early part of the engagement that he had already half forgotten, a general systemic fatigue that his body was going to present a detailed invoice for tomorrow, and began moving toward where he had last seen Bomb. Bomb was alive. He was sitting against a collapsed section of wall with his eyes closed and his breathing regular, doing something that Bang recognized as the specific internal practice their martial tradition used after extreme exertion to catalog damage and begin the first stages of recovery. Bang sat down beside him and did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said, and because the kind of communication that had passed between them in 60 years of shared history did not require words for its most important content. Flashy Flash was running a full systems diagnostic on his suit's monitoring equipment, not because he expected to find anything wrong with the equipment, but because running a diagnostic was a task with clear procedural steps and a defined endpoint, and he needed, in this specific moment, to be doing something that had a defined endpoint. The diagnostic was returning normal results on every system, which confirmed what he had already understood. The readings that had exceeded the equipment's range during the engagement had not been equipment failures. They had been accurate measurements of things the equipment's range had not been designed to accommodate. He finished the diagnostic and stood very still for a moment, looking at the altered skyline of Sector 9, and tried to construct a revised understanding of his place in the hierarchy of power that the world contained. The construction project was ongoing and was not going well, because every framework he reached for had been built on assumptions that the evening had invalidated, and building a new framework required foundation material that he had not yet identified. He put the project aside for later and focused on the immediate operational question, which was whether there were civilians still in the affected zones who needed to be moved, and whether his speed was useful for that. It was. He began moving. In the crater, Garou's consciousness was doing something that had no precedent in its evolution history, which was contracting. Not losing capacity, The vast architecture of awareness and processing that his evolution had constructed over the last 6 hours was still present and still functional, but pulling inward, away from the periphery, towards something more essential. The contraction was not voluntary. It was a response to what had happened, a kind of psychic reorientation triggered by the encounter with something that the entire outward expanding logic of his evolution had no answer for. He had been built by his own transformation into something that moved constantly outward. More power, more awareness, more transcendence. The perpetual motion of a being defined by the act of exceeding limits. The punch had introduced a direction his expansion could not address, and in the absence of a direction to expand toward, the expansion had paused, and in the pause something older and quieter had surfaced. Not weakness, not defeat in any simple sense. Something more like perspective, arriving uninvited and sitting down without asking permission, refusing to be evicted by the parts of him that still wanted to frame this as a temporary condition rather than a permanent revision. He looked up from the bottom of the crater at the night sky visible above the impact zone and thought about the boy he had been before all of this. Not with nostalgia. He was too far past the boy for nostalgia, but with a kind of clear-eyed curiosity about the distance between that origin point and where he currently was, and then a further curiosity about where Saitama's origin point was and what the distance looked like from there. He had evolved past the capacity for most ordinary human emotional responses, but what he was feeling now in the bottom of this crater was something that his expanded consciousness recognized as genuinely ordinary in the most profound sense. The ordinary experience of a being confronting its own finitude not as a temporary condition to be overcome, but as a structural fact that was not going to change regardless of the direction or intensity of effort applied to it. Garou had spent his entire existence defined by the premise that limits were wrong and could be overcome. He was lying in a crater made by a punch thrown by someone who had not been trying, and the premise was not holding. The Hero Association's first response teams arrived at the perimeter of Sector 9 23 minutes after the punch. They came with medical equipment, structural assessment tools, communications gear, and a debriefing protocol that had been designed for standard S-class engagement aftermaths, which assumed a certain kind of damage profile, and a certain kind of hero status report, and a certain kind of threat status summary. None of those assumptions applied to what they found. The damage profile was outside the assessment tool's calibration range, not different in kind from previous S-class aftermath profiles, but different in scale in a way that the tools expressed as measurement errors rather than measurements. The hero status reports were complicated by the fact that the heroes present were all physically present and alive, which was positive, but were in various states of processing and experience that the standard post-engagement psychological assessment framework had not been designed to evaluate, because the framework assumed that the psychological challenge of a difficult engagement was related to danger and fear and physical extremity. And what the heroes of Sector 9 needed to process was something different, not danger they had faced but scale they had witnessed, which was a different kind of challenge and required a different kind of support that the current protocols did not contain. The threat status summary was the most complicated part. The response team's senior officer, a woman named Akita who had been doing this job for 11 years and who had written portions of the standard post-engagement protocol herself, stood at the edge of the impact crater with her assessment tablet and looked at the space where the threat assessment section was supposed to be filled in. Primary threat, she wrote. Then she stopped. Garou was at the bottom of the crater and was clearly not in a condition to continue the engagement, and was also clearly still alive, which meant he needed to be classified as contained or neutralized or apprehended, or some other word that indicated the threat was resolved in a way that the existing resolution categories could accommodate. She looked at the categories. None of them felt accurate. Then she scrolled past the threat assessment section and went to the responding hero section and typed Caped Baldy, B-Class rank 7, and stared at it for a moment before adding a note that said, Classification Review recommended this entry and also the primary threat entry, and also possibly the entire classification framework, at your earliest convenience. Saitama was halfway home by the time the first response teams reached Sector 9. He had taken a route that avoided the worst of the debris fields, not because navigating debris was difficult but because it was slower, and he wanted to get the udon on before it got too late to eat properly. The pressure wave had opened in the cloud cover above Sector 9 was still visible behind him, a dark circular window in the low clouds through which the stars showed clearly. He did not look back at it. He had not looked back at all. He was thinking about whether he had a second packet of soy sauce at home, or whether he had used the last one last Tuesday, walking at a pace that covered ground efficiently without hurrying. A bald man in a discount hero suit carrying a convenient store bag through the restructured geography of a city that was in the process of learning something fundamental about the world it lived in. Something it would spend a long time digesting. Something that would change the way it thought about power and hierarchy, and the relationship between effort and outcome. Something that had arrived without announcement and departed the same way, leaving behind only a crater and a hole in the clouds, and the specific quality of silence that follows the end of a story that nobody had known was being told. The Hero Association's Board of Directors convened an emergency session at 11:47 that night in the reinforced conference room 3 levels below the Tactical Operations Center, which was the deepest room in the facility, and the one they used when they wanted the physical fact of several meters of concrete between themselves and the surface to do some psychological work on their behalf. All 7 board members were present in person, which had not happened since the incident 3 years ago that had required the simultaneous deployment of 4 S-class heroes, and had resulted in a property damage bill that had taken 8 months to negotiate with the government. That incident had felt, at the time, like the upper boundary of what the board needed to be prepared for. Sitting in the underground conference room at 11:47, watching the compiled drone footage from Sector 9 on the room's main screen, each of them was doing a private revision of what the upper boundary of preparedness actually needed to look like, and none of the revisions were producing comfortable numbers. Sitch had been asked to brief the board directly, which she was doing from the head of the table with the specific economy of language she used when she needed to convey a large amount of information to people who were not going to enjoy receiving it. She had organized the briefing into 3 sections. The first section covered the evening's events in chronological sequence: Garou's escalating evolution, the S-class deployment and its results, Saitama's arrival and the subsequent engagement, the terminal event and its physical consequences. She presented this section without editorial because the facts were sufficient and editorial would have been redundant. The board watched and listened and asked no questions during this section, which told her they understood that questions would not change anything about what they were hearing, and that the time for questions was the second section. The second section covered the institutional implications, which was where she had concentrated most of her preparation, because the institutional implications were the part that required the board to make decisions, and the decisions needed to be made quickly and needed to be the right ones. She told them that the Hero Association's classification system had failed in 2 distinct ways during the Sector 9 engagement. It had failed to accurately classify the threat that Garou represented as his evolution exceeded its upper categories, and it had catastrophically failed to classify the hero resource that Saitama represented. Having assigned him to B-class on the basis of an assessment that had produced no valid data, and which had been incorrectly attributed to equipment malfunction, rather than correctly attributed to measurement impossibility. Both failures had operational consequences that needed to be addressed, but the second failure was the more significant one, because the first failure was a failure of ceiling. The system had run out of room above its top category, while the second failure was a failure of foundation. The system had been operating on the assumption that its assessment methodology was valid, and the methodology was not valid for entities like Saitama. And nobody had known this because nobody had previously encountered an entity like Saitama and survived the encounter in a condition to file a report. The board chair asked Sitch what she recommended for the classification system revision. She told him the revision needed to do two things simultaneously. It needed to add tiers above the current S-class ceiling to accommodate entities at Garou's level of evolution or beyond, and it needed to add an entirely separate assessment pathway for entities whose power output exceeded the upper measurement limit of the current assessment equipment. Because assigning those entities a classification based on the existing scale was not classification. It was the appearance of classification. And the appearance of classification was more dangerous than acknowledged ignorance because it produced false confidence in a picture of the power landscape that was wrong. The board chair asked what the separate assessment pathway would look like. Sitch said she did not know yet, and that knowing would require consulting with the S-class heroes who had been present in Sector 9 tonight, particularly Bang and Flashy Flash. And also, she paused here briefly, with the specific quality of pause that precedes something the speaker knows the listener will find uncomfortable. It would require a direct conversation with Saitama. The board was quiet for a moment. Then one of the board members asked whether Saitama was likely to cooperate with a direct assessment conversation. Sitch thought about the convenience store bag and the expired coupon and the expression on Saitama's face at every point in the engagement, and said that cooperating was probably not the right frame, that Saitama was not the kind of entity that you cooperated with or failed to cooperate with, that he was the kind of entity that you tried to understand on his own terms, and that understanding him was going to require the board to set aside several assumptions about how power and institutional hierarchy interacted that they had been operating on for as long as the association had existed. The board received this information, and the underground conference room was quiet for long enough that the ambient hum of the facility's ventilation system became audible. The third section of Sitch's briefing covered the external implications, which were in several ways more immediately pressing than the internal ones, because the external implications were already in motion and could not be paused for institutional deliberation. The civilian footage from the observation line outside the perimeter had been widely distributed by the time the board convened, not viral in the frivolous sense, but present everywhere that information traveled, watched by an audience whose size the Hero Association's communications team was still calculating, and whose interpretation of what they had seen was already fragmenting into the specific range of responses that major destabilizing public events always produced. A significant portion of the audience was processing the footage through a lens of awe and security. They had seen something extraordinary, and the extraordinary thing had resolved in a way that preserved the city and produced no civilian casualties, and they were filing this under the category of hero activity that reinforced their faith in the system. A smaller but louder portion was processing it through a lens of institutional failure. They had seen an entity classified as B-class rank 7 do something that the entire S-class tier had been unable to do, and they were asking pointed questions about what the classification system was actually for, and what they were paying the Hero Association to provide. And a third portion, smaller than the second but potentially more consequential, was processing it through a lens that did not have a simple name. A lens that looked at a bald man in a discount hero suit, catching an evolution tier strike with one hand while holding groceries with the other, and produced not faith in the system or criticism of the system, but a question about the system's relevance. A quiet wondering about whether the category of institution that existed to protect them from threats was meaningful in a world that apparently also contained Saitama. In a building across the city that had no visible signage and no entry in any public property registry, the organization that had been watching the Sector 9 engagement from their private operations center was conducting a parallel debrief that was arriving at conclusions similar to Sitch's, but with a different emotional texture. Sitch's debrief was shaped by institutional responsibility. She was trying to fix something that had failed in order to make it work better. The private organization's debrief was shaped by something colder and more pragmatic, which was the recognition that an asset they had not known existed had tonight demonstrated capabilities that their organization needed to understand, and that their previous operational picture, which had identified Garou as the most significant uncontrolled power variable in the current environment, had been wrong in a way that required them to completely restructure their risk assessment and their strategic priorities. The man running the room had spent an hour on the phone after the footage arrived, talking to people above him in a hierarchy that did not appear in any organizational chart, and the conversations had produced a consensus that the organization needed direct information about Saitama. Not his hero file, which was useless, not the drone footage, which was useful but incomplete, but direct information, the kind that came from proximity and observation, and if possible, interaction. He assigned 3 people to begin building a plan for acquiring that information. He told them to be careful. He told them this not as a standard operational instruction, but with a specific personal emphasis that the 3 people in the room understood was based on something he had seen in the footage that had affected him in a way that his professional discipline was not completely containing. The S-Class heroes who had been present in Sector 9 were dispersed across 3 different medical facilities by midnight, receiving treatment that their bodies needed and processing that their minds were conducting in parallel without being asked. Bang and Bomb were in the same facility, in adjacent rooms, which had been arranged not by any official coordination, but because the response team that had transported them had understood without being told that separation was not appropriate. Bang was awake, declining the sleep medication the medical staff were offering, sitting in his hospital bed with his hands folded in his lap doing something that looked like stillness, but was actually the most active kind of thinking he knew how to do. He was thinking about a young man he had expelled from his dojo years ago, a student who had been talented and angry, and had taken his talent and his anger somewhere that Bang had hoped he would not go. He was thinking about what that young man had become tonight, and what had ended that becoming, and whether ended was the right word, and whether there was something in the ending that contained something worth understanding. He was thinking about Saitama, whom he had known for a while now in the vague, peripheral way that one knows a neighbor who is quiet and unassuming, and whose depths you have not previously had occasion to sound. He was thinking about the depth, now that he had glimpsed it, and about the fact that the depth had been present all along, visible to anyone who had known where to look, and that nobody had looked because the appearance was so completely inconsistent with what the depth contained that the appearance had functioned as a perfect concealment, not through any intent on Saitama's part, but simply because the world was not built to look past a discount costume and a blank hero file towards something that its classification systems had no room for. Bang sat with this and was awake for a long time. They brought Garou out of the crater at 1:17 in the morning. It took 6 response team members and a piece of lifting equipment that had been designed for extracting trapped civilians from collapsed structures, because Garou's evolved form was not cooperating with the extraction in any active sense. He was not resisting, but he was also not helping, which in practical terms meant he was a very large, very dense, very structurally unusual weight that needed to be moved from a deep, irregular space to a flat surface, without causing additional injury to a body that had already experienced something the responding medics' training had not prepared them to evaluate. The senior medic on site, a man named Tanaka who had been doing disaster response work for 14 years, and who had treated heroes and monsters in roughly equal proportion over that time, looked at Garou's vitals on his monitoring equipment, and then looked at Garou, and then looked at the equipment again in the specific way of someone checking whether the instrument and the observable reality are in agreement. They were in agreement. Garou's vitals were stable, which was medically speaking a positive outcome, and which was also, given what Tanaka had watched happen in Sector 9 tonight, one of the more remarkable facts he had encountered in 14 years of remarkable work. He wrote stable in the field assessment log, and then wrote condition unprecedented in the notes section, and then stood back and let the extraction team finish their work. Garou was conscious through the extraction. He was aware of the equipment and the personnel and the operational activity around him, with the same expanded sensory clarity that his evolution had been providing for the last several hours, and he was doing nothing with this awareness except receiving it, because doing something with awareness required a direction, and he had not yet identified a direction. The crater was 4 meters deep and 12 meters wide, and the walls of it were compressed into a smoothness that the extraction team's structural assessment specialist noted was inconsistent with any impact event in her professional experience. Because impacts produced irregular damage, and this crater had been produced by something that apparently did not distribute its force irregularly. She noted this in her report and moved on, because the night had been full of things inconsistent with professional experience, and she had developed, over the last several hours, a practical policy of noting them accurately and processing them later. Garou watched her work with the detached clarity of someone observing activity that is adjacent to them but not about them, and this detachment was not a practiced stillness or a strategic withdrawal. It was the natural state of a consciousness that had expanded to a scale where the immediate and the operational had become very small relative to everything else the consciousness was simultaneously containing. What the consciousness was containing primarily was the question. It had arrived during the silence following the punch, and it had not left, and it was not going to leave, because it was the kind of question that does not leave once it has arrived. Not a rhetorical question, not a question with a negotiable answer, but a question whose answer was fixed and whose arrival changed the entire architecture of the consciousness that now held it. The question was simple in its formulation, which was part of what made it so difficult to contain. The question was, what do you do when the thing you have been becoming is not the thing that matters? Garou had spent his existence in a process of becoming stronger, becoming more, becoming the thing that the world's systems of power could not contain or classify or defeat. The becoming had been the purpose. The becoming had been the answer to everything the world had done to him, every injustice and humiliation and exclusion that his origin had contained, every monster he had chosen over the heroes who had failed to embody what they claimed to represent. He had been becoming the ultimate answer, the final argument, the proof that the world's hierarchies were arbitrary and its ceilings were illusions, and that will directed with sufficient intensity could exceed any limit the system imposed. And then Saitama had arrived with groceries and caught his most evolved strike in one hand and thrown a casual jab that had put him in a crater, and the becoming had encountered its limit, and the limit was not a higher ceiling. It was the discovery that ceilings were real, that they were not illusions created by insufficient will but structural features of the space that a given being occupied, and that Saitama occupied a different space entirely. A space so far above the space where ceilings lived that the concept of ceiling had lost its meaning there, not because Saitama had transcended limits, but because he existed in a location where limits were not the organizing principle. The question was not how to reach that space. Garou's evolved consciousness was large enough to understand, with a clarity that was not pleasant but was precise, that reaching was not the mechanism. You did not reach Saitama's space through effort or evolution or will. It was not a destination that directed motion could arrive at. It was something else, something his consciousness was circling without being able to name, something that lived in the specific quality of Saitama's indifference, in the casual motion of the grocery bag, in the mild expression that had not changed regardless of what the engagement produced. The extraction team got him onto a flat surface at 1:34, and Tanaka did a full physical assessment that took 20 minutes, and that Garou allowed without comment. The assessment produced results that Tanaka added to the unprecedented notes column, structural coherence, that should not have been possible given the force of the impact that had produced the crater. A healing response that was already underway at a cellular level, and was proceeding at a rate his monitoring equipment flagged as an error before he told it to just accept the reading. A neurological profile that his assessment tools produced conflicting reports about because the tools had been calibrated for human neurological ranges, and Garou's neurological architecture had been human once, but was no longer human in any way that the calibration was designed to address. Tanaka finished the assessment and told the team to prepare for transport, and went to make a call to the Tactical Operations Center to report his preliminary findings. While he was making the call, Garou looked up at the sky above the extraction site, the same sky, the same hole in the clouds, the same stars, and the question was still there. And alongside it now was something that had not been there before, which was the faint, uncomfortable beginning of an answer. The answer was not about power. That was the uncomfortable part, the part his entire constructed identity resisted, the part that all of his evolution had been building away from rather than toward. The answer was about something that Saitama and Garou had been destroying in himself as a feature of his evolution, rather than a limitation to overcome. He did not have a name for it yet. He had the shape of it, the shape visible in the grocery bag, in the expired coupon, in the mild expression, in the way Saitama had looked into the crater not with triumph or cold assessment, but with something that had looked, impossibly, like mild sympathy. The shape of it was ordinary, profoundly, stubbornly, almost aggressively ordinary. And Garou's consciousness, which had spent the evening becoming the least ordinary thing in the world, circled this shape in the dark and could not decide whether what it felt about the shape was grief or recognition or both, or whether grief and recognition, at sufficient scale, were the same thing wearing different names. In Bang's hospital room, at 2:15 in the morning, a nurse came in to check his monitoring equipment and found him still awake and asked if he needed anything. He said no, and then, after she had checked the equipment and was leaving, he said actually, one thing. He asked her if she knew whether anyone had checked on the young man they had brought in from the crater. She told him that the patient from the crater had been transported to the secure medical wing and was stable. Bang nodded. He said that was good. He said the young man had been one of his students once, a long time ago, before things had gone the way they went, and that he had a question for him when the time was appropriate. The nurse said she would pass that along. Bang thanked her and then turned toward the window of his room, which showed him not the sky but the lit face of the building across the street, and he sat with the question he was going to ask Garou, and the question he had been sitting with since he had watched Saitama walk north toward home with his groceries. And somewhere in the space between those two questions was something that felt, tentatively and without certainty, but genuinely, like the beginning of an understanding that he had not previously had access to. He was 60 years old and had believed he had learned most of what the world was going to teach him. The night had rearranged that belief gently but completely, and he was sitting with the rearrangement the way you sit with something that has cost you something and given you something in the same motion. And he was not yet sure about the accounting, but he was not going to sleep until he had tried to get closer to it. The sun came up over the eastern districts at 5:43 and found a city that was the same city it had been the day before in every way that could be measured by looking at a map, and completely different in every way that mattered. The geography was altered. Sector 9 and the surrounding blocks had a new topography that the city planning office's automated survey systems were going to spend 3 days trying to accurately document, because the standard survey parameters had been calibrated for damage profiles that human engineering had produced, and what had happened in Sector 9 was not consistent with human engineering in any of the ways the parameters were designed to detect. The streets that had been straight were still not straight. The impact crater was still 4 meters deep and 12 meters wide, and still smooth-walled in a way that the structural assessment team's follow-up report described as physically anomalous and left at that. The hole in the clouds had closed sometime in the early morning hours, the atmospheric pressure having gradually equalized, and the cloud cover having drifted back into the space the pressure wave had cleared. So the stars were no longer visible above Sector 9, and would not be visible again until the next clear night, when they would be visible to anyone who chose to look up, which most people in the city did not do regularly, but which some of them, after the night they had experienced, were going to start doing more often. The Hero Association's public communications team released a statement at 6:30 that had gone through 11 drafts in 4 hours, which was a record for the communications team, and which showed in the final product in the specific way that overdrafted documents show. A certain smoothness that was slightly too smooth. A certain confidence that sat slightly uncomfortably on the facts it was supposed to be expressing. The statement confirmed that a significant threat event had occurred in the eastern districts, that S-Class heroes had responded, that the threat had been neutralized, and that the Hero Association was conducting a full operational review. It mentioned Saitama once, in a subordinate clause, as a contributing hero whose involvement had been decisive. It did not mention his rank. The communications team had debated this point through 3 of the 11 drafts, and had landed on omission as less problematic than the alternative, which was including the rank and inviting every reader to do the arithmetic between B-Class rank 7 and the footage that had been circulating for 6 hours, and arrive at questions the communications team had no good answers for. The omission did not prevent the arithmetic. The arithmetic was being done everywhere the footage had reached, which was everywhere, and the questions were being asked with an urgency that the statement's smoothness was not equipped to address. Sitch arrived at the Tactical Operations Center at 6:50, having slept for 90 minutes on a cot in the facility's break room, which was not sufficient, but was what the night had made available. She had a cup of coffee and the preliminary version of the operational review document that her team had been building since 2 in the morning, and she sat down at her station and read through it with the focused attention of someone who understood that the document in front of them was not just an after-action report, but the first draft of a new institutional framework, and that first drafts of new institutional frameworks required more honesty than institutional documents usually contained. The document was more honest than usual. Her team had understood the assignment. The section on classification system failures was clear and unsparing. The section on Saitama was the most carefully written part, not hedged, not evasive, but precise about the boundaries of what was known versus what was inferred versus what was simply beyond the current framework's capacity to address. The section concluded with a recommendation that she had written herself at 4 in the morning, in the break room, before she had slept, while the 90-minute window was still ahead of her and the full weight of the night was still present. The recommendation said that the Hero Association needed to revise its foundational premise, not just its classification tiers, not just its assessment methodology, but the foundational premise that the power landscape it operated within was a landscape the association was equipped to fully map. The premise was wrong. The association did not know the full dimensions of the space it was working in, and operating as if it did was not confidence. It was a liability, and the liability had been demonstrated at scale the previous evening, and the demonstration needed to produce a genuine institutional change rather than a classification update that preserved the appearance of comprehensive understanding, while the underlying assumption remained intact. Across the city, in an apartment building in a residential district that had not been affected by the evening's events, and whose windows showed a view of rooftops and a slice of morning sky, Saitama woke up at 7:15 with the specific feeling of someone who had gone to bed later than they intended, and whose sleep, while complete, had not been quite long enough. He lay on his futon for a moment doing the small inventory of the morning. Weather through the window looked overcast, the udon had been good, The coupon situation was a loss he had accepted and moved past. He got up and went to the kitchen and found that he did have a second packet of soy sauce, which resolved a question that had been faintly present in his mind since the walk home. He put water on for tea and stood at the kitchen window while he waited for it to boil, looking at the overcast sky and the rooftops and the slice of morning that was his regular view, the view that had not changed. He thought about the fight in a vague, unfocused way, not analyzing it, not replaying it, but letting it sit at the periphery of his attention, the way events sit when they have been processed and filed, and are available for reference if needed, but are not requiring active engagement. He had gone to check on a noise. There had been a fight. He had ended it. He had gotten home in time for the udon, which had been good, though the coupon loss took some of the edge off. This was the full shape of the evening as Saitama currently held it, and the shape was not inadequate to the evening. It was simply the shape that fit his relationship to it, which was a relationship defined by an absence of investment in outcomes that other people built entire identities around. The tea boiled. He poured it and sat at his low table and looked at the morning. The Hero Association was going to call. He was aware of this in the background, not anticipating it, not dreading it, just aware that it would happen and that when it happened he would answer the phone and say whatever seemed appropriate and the call would end and the morning would continue. Somewhere on the other side of the city, a crater he had made was being documented and analyzed and added to an institutional record that was going to generate a very large amount of activity in a very large number of buildings for a very long time. Somewhere in a secure medical wing, a young man who had spent the night at the bottom of that crater was lying in a bed being attended to by people who did not know what to do with his vitals, thinking thoughts that Saitama could not read and did not know about. Somewhere, Bang and Bomb were in adjacent hospital rooms, and Bang was awake with a question he was saving. Somewhere, Flashy Flash was revising a framework. Somewhere, governments and institutions and private organizations were updating their operational pictures and discovering that the pictures needed to be larger than they had believed, and that the extra space they needed to add was occupied by a bald man who was currently drinking tea and thinking about whether he had any plans for the afternoon. He did not have any plans for the afternoon. This was fine. He drank his tea and the morning continued, and the city outside his window was the same city and also not the same city, and the difference between those two things was not something that required his attention right now. The clouds moved in the slice of sky visible above the rooftops. A bird crossed from one side to the other and did not come back. Below him, several floors down, someone was starting a vehicle and the engine turned over with a cough and then settled. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning in a city that had last night discovered something about itself that it was going to spend a long time understanding. Saitama finished his tea and rinsed the cup and set it on the drying rack and thought he might go for a walk later. See if that new discount store had opened yet, the one he had seen a sign for last week. Maybe check if they had any good coupons. He was not in a hurry. He had nowhere to be. The city had changed permanently and irreversibly around him. Its institutions cracked open and rebuilding. Its power landscape redrawn from foundations that would never again pretend to be comprehensive. Its heroes sitting in hospitals and thinking new thoughts about old assumptions. Its governments updating documents that would determine how the world understood power for years to come. And at the center of all of it, the reason for all of it, the thing that had changed everything by doing almost nothing, was a man with no plans for the afternoon, standing at a kitchen window in a discount hero suit, watching a bird that had already gone. The world did not go back to normal. Normal had ended at 8:47 the previous evening when a palm catch had redrawn the boundary between what the world thought it contained and what it actually contained, and boundaries, once redrawn, do not return to their previous positions regardless of how convenient the previous position had been. The Hero Association would rebuild. The classification system would be revised. The governments would update their protocols. The private organization across the city would continue its work, more carefully now, with a different set of assumptions. Garou would survive, and the question in his consciousness would eventually find its shape, and the shape would not be what he expected, and the unexpected shape would become the foundation of something that nobody, including Garou, could currently see the outline of. Bang would have his conversation. Flash would finish his framework revision, at least partially. The city would repair, as cities do, its geography gradually accommodating the new features the night had introduced, until the new features became ordinary landmarks, and the ordinary landmarks became the background of lives that had continued through the disruption, and out the other side. All of this would happen because life is what happens in the aftermath of extraordinary events, and the aftermath is always longer and quieter and more important than the event itself. But the boundary would not move back. The knowledge that the world contained Saitama, that the power landscape extended into spaces the institutional frameworks had not mapped and could not map with their current instruments, that somewhere in a residential district, in an apartment above a slice of rooftops, there was a man whose relationship to power was so far outside the existing categories that the categories had no useful commentary to offer. That knowledge was now part of the world's self-understanding in a way that could not be unlearned. The world was not the same world. It was the same streets and buildings and people and morning sounds, and it was a world that knew something about itself it had not known before, and knowing changes the shape of a world the way a punch changes the shape of a street, permanently and without the possibility of return. Saitama put on his shoes and went for a walk. The morning was cool. The discount store was open. They had coupons.